If I told you that the greatest moment in human history happened in a place that smelled like animals, you'd probably assume I was joking. You see, we glamorize Christmas so much to the point that we forget that it wasn't glamorous at all. It was inconvenience, rejection, and a whole lot of, that wasn't supposed to happen that way. But maybe, just maybe, that's the whole point. Welcome into another episode of the GC Show. I hope y'all are doing absolutely amazing. And welcome into part 4 here of our Christmas series, where we're looking at different people and different parts in the story of Christmas and the significance and role that they play. And here in part 4, we're looking at the significance of the stable and the birth of Jesus. So let's dive right into it. Our passage this week comes from Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. And it says, "At that time, the Roman Emperor Augustus decreed that a census should be taken throughout the Roman Empire. This was the first census taken when Quirinius was governor of Syria." Now, let's take a time out here. In verse 2, why was it mentioned that Quirinius was governor of Syria? Because he had absolutely nothing to do with the story of Christmas. But what this shows is that the event of Jesus being born isn't just some made-up story or some fable. This is something that is recorded in human history. The birth of Jesus is something that actually happened. Now, if we continue on reading past verse 2, picking up in verse 3, it says, "All returned to their own ancestral towns to register for the census. And because Joseph was a descendant of King David, he had to go to Bethlehem in Judea, David's ancient home. He traveled there from the village of Nazareth in Galilee." So we see here in verse 4 that Joseph and Mary go to Bethlehem. And here, something important about Bethlehem, we have to flip back to Micah chapter 5, verse 2, a prophecy in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, that says, "But you, O Bethlehem, Ephrathah," I think that's how you say it, "are only a small village among all the people of Judah. Yet a ruler of Israel, whose origins are in the distant past, will come from you on my behalf." Now, this prophecy in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, this was a prophecy from over 700 years ago, from the time before Jesus was born. And I think that fact 700 years ago flies over our head a little bit. You know, think about it this way. Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 and came to the Americas, which from the year 2025, that was 533 years ago that happened. This prophecy about where Jesus was going to be born was 700 years ago, which means that God over that time did not forget about this prophecy that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem. And for so long, people were waiting and waiting for this Messiah, but God never forgot about where the Messiah would be born and about bringing the Messiah into the world to save all of humanity. Now, based on this prophecy in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, Jesus couldn't be born in the city of Nazareth where Joseph and Mary were from. He had to be born in Bethlehem. So what this shows is that God works through world events, because this decree for this census that sent everyone back to their hometown of their ancestors led Joseph and Mary back to Bethlehem, which was ultimately where Jesus was born, to fulfill that prophecy. Because if Jesus was born in Nazareth, the prophecy of the Messiah coming out of Bethlehem would not have been fulfilled. It's just crazy to look at that and know that God continues to connect every little thing for the good. Now, something else I thought was kind of interesting about Bethlehem whenever I was researching is that Bethlehem in Hebrew means house of bread. And if you know about Jesus, in John chapter 6, verse 35, Jesus calls himself the bread of life, meaning that Jesus being born in Bethlehem means that the bread of life was born in the house of bread. I mean, isn't that just something that's kind of crazy in itself? I thought that was worthy of noting. Now, if we continue reading on, picking up in verse 5, it's talking about Joseph. It says, "He took with him Mary, to whom he was engaged, who was now expecting a child. And while they were there, the time came for her baby to be born. She gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger, because there was no lodging available for them in the inn." Now, something important to note that I think doesn't really get enough recognition ever is in verse 7 when it says she gave birth to her firstborn son. Why doesn't it just say that Mary gave birth to a child or to her son? Why does it mention firstborn son? Now, in Jewish culture, In the Old Testament, the firstborn son had special status, had inheritance rights, and was considered set apart by God. This firstborn son, whenever the father would die, all the inheritance would go directly to this firstborn son and to none of the other siblings or children in the family. Now, why it was mentioned that Jesus was the firstborn son is because he as well is preeminent. He is supreme, and he is the one with highest authority. And that doesn't just go for Jesus in his family, but this goes for Jesus throughout all the earth. Jesus is highest and most supreme of anyone in all the earth, and he is the one with most authority, sitting on the right hand of the throne of God. Now, also the Bible mentioning that Jesus was a firstborn son shows that he was fully human. He was a firstborn son born into a family, just like how me and you were also born as a baby. You hear some people out here, like atheists, for example, saying that maybe Jesus just spawned in one day, that at 30 he spawned in, started teaching, and then died around 33 years old. But what this tells us here in Luke chapter 2 is that Jesus was born as a baby just like you and just like me, and he grew up just like you and just like me, but he didn't sin just like you and just like me. That's what set him apart and made him different. Now, if we look back again at verse 7, it says she wrapped him, talking about Mary, she wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger. Now, Jesus being born in a manger is a sign of humility. You would think for the Messiah, the King, probably the Old Testament Jewish leaders, they thought that Jesus would come, he'd be born in a palace, and there'd be all this news, and the whole city and the whole world would come and praise this baby, praise the Messiah that was being born in the palace. But that's not how it went down at all. Jesus entered the world not through a palace, not through a house, but in a place where animals eat. Isn't that crazy? Now, we look at the nativity, and I think here in 2025, and really throughout, for a long time, we glamorize the nativity so much. People have displays of the nativity in their yard, or have displays of the nativity with the little characters or something. But we look at it and we say, oh, the nativity's so beautiful, it looks so perfect. But it was quite the opposite. If you've ever been in a barn or a horse stable, you would know that it's smelly, it's dirty, and it is the opposite of perfect. And that's exactly where Jesus was born. There was nothing glamorous about the manger where Jesus was born. It was literally a stable where animals lived. It was not beautiful in any way, shape, or form. And that just goes to show Jesus' humility, because God became human and chose the lowest, most ordinary place. Now, if we take a deeper look at the manger, the manger wasn't just the place where Jesus was laid, but it was the place where animals ate out of, which just continues to go to show how disgusting and how unglamorous the birth of Jesus really was, that he was laid in the place where animals eat. But there's much symbolism with that as well. That Jesus, going back to John chapter 6:35, where he mentions that he is the bread of life. The bread of life was physically laid in the place that animals eat out of. And that's symbolism for Jesus' mission later here on this earth. That Jesus came to nourish the world spiritually, and that was his mission here on this earth. If we look back at the end of verse 7, after it says that Mary wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger, it says, because there was no lodging available for them in the inn. I think, again, we kind of breeze over this a little bit and think, oh, the hotel was full, so they just went to the next option, which was the manger. But there's deeper symbolism here. It shows that Jesus was rejected and pushed aside even before he was born. And if you know about his ministry when he was here on earth, he was often rejected by Pharisees and religious leaders and pushed aside by the people in this world. And he was rejected to the point where he was crucified on a cross. So even before Jesus was born, the King of the world was rejected by the world before he was even born. So what can we ultimately learn from the birth of Jesus foretold in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 7? Is that Jesus ultimately came to be the bread of life that would nourish people spiritually. And that as Christians, we often glamorize Christmas as way more glamorous than what it actually was, because the birth of Jesus in the first Christmas was nowhere near glamorous, but the final result that came out of it was the greatest gift that anyone could ever receive. And that is the lesson for today. That's a wrap for this week's episode. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, be sure to let me know down below. And if you know of anyone who may be interested in this episode, a friend or a family member, I'd encourage you to share with them, because the goal of the GC show is to bring them all to heaven, point even just one more person toward Christ. And as I've mentioned here in the last few episodes, if you have a prayer request, something weighing heavy on your heart, something you're going through, in this Christmas season, it can be a hard time for some of you, a very stressful time, a time of anxiety, and a time that's just, you got a lot weighing on your heart. So if you have something, a prayer request, just something going on in your life, something that's weighing heavy on your heart, I'd encourage you to reach out in some way, shape, or form so that I can be praying for you. If you haven't already, be sure to follow us on all the socials so you don't miss out on any new GC Show content or any new GC Show episodes. And if you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to check out this one right over here, because I believe that it is for you. With that being said, thank you guys for listening. I'll see you Thursday. Be great today, and praise God.